The courtroom buzzed with the usual hum of cases being heard. Judge Nathaniel Harris sat high on his bench, his gavel poised to strike with authority. At 57, with a long history in law, Harris prided himself on being methodical, unyielding, and fair, at least in his own eyes. Today was no different, or so he thought. The case before him was a simple traffic violation. A woman, Naomi Walker, stood alone in the defendant's chair. She was dressed plainly, wearing a muted jacket and dark slacks. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tidy bun, and she spoke with a calm, almost measured tone. Her demeanor seemed so ordinary that Judge Harris barely took a second glance. Traffic court was full of people just like her, people who had committed minor infractions, had no idea what they were doing, and probably couldn't afford the fine they'd just received. That was the way the system worked, or at least that's how Harris saw it. Ms. Walker, you've been cited for parking in a no-standing zone, and you were driving without proper registration. Judge Harris read from the paperwork in front of him. You've already had your chance to contest these charges, and I've reviewed the evidence. You've also missed your scheduled court date twice, and that complicates matters. Naomi remained silent, her eyes locked on the judge as she waited for him to continue. She knew she'd be penalized, but this was part of the process. She had handled much more complicated issues in her professional life, where millions of dollars were at stake, and entire networks of corrupt officials were involved. Yet here she was, standing in front of this judge, facing a fine for something as mundane as a parking ticket. Judge Harris glanced at the paperwork again. Given your past record, I'm issuing a fine of $500, he said with authority, then paused. Perhaps this will serve as a wake-up call to take the system more seriously next time. Naomi nodded politely. Thank you, Your Honor, she said softly, her voice betraying no hint of frustration. She had no intention of fighting this. There were far more important battles to fight. With a quiet dignity, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the tile floor. Her composed exit seemed to suggest she was just another person going through the motions of a broken system. As the doors closed behind her, Judge Harris shuffled his papers and leaned back in his chair, content that he'd made another swift ruling. He didn't give Naomi another thought. To him, this was just another day on the job, another person who had missed their chance to comply with the law. What Judge Harris didn't know, what no one knew, was that Naomi Walker wasn't just any ordinary citizen. She was a leader in a global movement, one that fought against corruption and injustice at the highest levels. And soon, the story of their encounter would make its way into a much larger conversation. Naomi Walker had long since learned the art of blending into the background. To the outside world, she was just another professional woman, doing what was expected of her, attending meetings, filing paperwork, and handling legal matters like the one in Judge Harris' courtroom. But there was much more to Naomi than met the eye. In reality, Naomi was at the forefront of the fight against global corruption. As the leader of the International Anti-Corruption Task Force, IACTF, she was responsible for coordinating complex investigations across borders, working with governments, nonprofits, and international organizations to expose hidden networks of fraud, bribery, and embezzlement. Her team had brought down some of the most notorious criminal syndicates in the world, from corrupt politicians to corporate CEOs skimming millions from public funds. Her role required discretion, tact, and a relentless focus on justice. In the public eye, Naomi's name was often linked to high-profile investigations, but her face rarely appeared on the front pages. The nature of her work meant she stayed out of the limelight. Even her friends and family didn't fully understand the scope of what she did. Naomi had a quiet strength, one that didn't need recognition. It was the results that mattered. But today, Naomi was facing a very different challenge, one she had not expected. The traffic violation she had been fined for was a minor blip in her otherwise extraordinary life. It was almost laughable in comparison to the stakes she dealt with regularly. Yet, her interaction with Judge Harris had left her with a quiet sense of unease. He had treated her as just another face in a crowded courtroom, not knowing who she really was. Naomi had grown accustomed to people underestimating her, but something about the way the judge had dismissed her made her wonder just how many others she had encountered in her work held similar biases. Naomi had learned the hard way that people often made assumptions based on appearances. Her calm demeanor, her professional attire. These were the things people saw first, and they often failed to look deeper. Naomi knew that in the world she navigated, appearances meant little. Corruption often hid behind a facade of respectability, and the truth was rarely as simple as it seemed. Yet today's experience felt different. It felt like another reminder of how easily authority figures could dismiss individuals who didn't fit a certain mold. As she left the courthouse, Naomi's thoughts were already shifting. She would take action, but not in the way most would expect. The legal battle ahead was far more important than any fine or ticket. It was about challenging the very biases and assumptions that allowed systems of power to remain unchecked. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was a fight she was uniquely equipped to handle. She glanced at her phone, checking messages from her team. There were more important matters waiting for her, but something told her that her next move needed to involve more than just paperwork and investigations. It was time to make a statement, not just as an anti-corruption leader, but as a woman who refused to be underestimated. The next morning, Naomi Walker's name was splashed across the headlines. The story wasn't about a simple traffic violation. No, it was about the woman behind one of the most impactful anti-corruption initiatives in the world. Naomi had been featured in a major international news outlet for her role in uncovering a vast network of financial crimes that spanned across multiple countries. It was a bombshell story, one that shed light on how deep corruption ran in both the public and private sectors, and how Naomi's team had been instrumental in exposing it. The article detailed her leadership in exposing a vast web of offshore accounts linked to multinational companies and corrupt politicians. For Naomi, it was just another day at the office, another investigation successfully brought to light. But to the public, it was something much more significant. Naomi's work was a testament to how individuals could challenge systems of power that seemed insurmountable. It also painted a clear picture of the risks she faced. Many of the people she had brought to justice were not small-time offenders. They were powerful figures with far-reaching influence. As the story spread, Naomi's name was suddenly everywhere, on TV screens, in social media feeds, in op-eds, and on talk shows. Her work was celebrated by international organizations and anti-corruption advocates. She was hailed as a hero, a force for global justice. Yet despite the fame that came with her position, Naomi was hardly a stranger to staying in the shadows. The media exposure didn't excite her. It was the impact of her work that drove her. But now, people were paying attention, and one of those people, unbeknownst to Naomi, was Judge Nathaniel Harris. In his office, Judge Harris sat back in his chair, scanning the morning paper. As a man who had prided himself on being well-informed, he rarely skipped over the headlines. But today, his attention was drawn to a piece that mentioned Naomi Walker. He hadn't expected to see her name again. The woman who had stood before him in his courtroom the day before, who had seemed so unremarkable, was now the subject of an in-depth investigative report. His eyes widened as he read further. Naomi Walker, leader of the International Anti-Corruption Task Force. The same woman he had fined $500 for a parking infraction. He reread the article, now fully aware of Naomi's high-profile work. The more he absorbed, the more uncomfortable he felt. How could he have been so quick to judge her? The woman he had dismissed as just another defendant in a crowded court was, in fact, one of the most significant players in a global movement for justice. The revelation unsettled Harris, and a part of him began to question the assumptions he had made. As much as he wanted to dismiss the guilt he felt, it lingered. There was something about Naomi that now seemed so much larger than the brief courtroom exchange they'd had. He picked up the phone, dialing his secretary. "Get me everything on Naomi Walker," he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and self-reflection. "I need to understand who she really is." As Harris dug deeper into Naomi's work, it became clear this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was a case that challenged his perception of justice and the type of person who was truly deserving of it. The moment Naomi Walker's story broke, the world took notice. Her work in leading the International Anti-Corruption Task Force had been hidden in the shadows for years, but the press coverage shed light on her unparalleled achievements. From exposing the complex web of corporate malfeasance to uncovering global political corruption, Naomi had become a symbol of integrity in a world rife with deceit. News outlets were filled with stories of how she had navigated dangerous waters, broken through seemingly impenetrable networks, and relentlessly pursued justice, no matter the cost. What the media didn't expect, however, was the immediate public reaction. People from all walks of life, from global activists to ordinary citizens, began to share their admiration for Naomi. Social media exploded with support. Hashtags like #JusticeForNaomi and #AntiCorruptionHero spread like wildfire. Online communities started sharing stories of how Naomi's work had affected their own countries, how entire political systems had been reshaped because of the data and revelations she had uncovered. It wasn't just Naomi's accomplishments that captured public attention. It was the story of how she had been treated by Judge Harris in the courtroom. People quickly began connecting the dots, realizing that the woman who had been dismissed by a judge over a simple parking ticket was a leader in one of the most important global justice movements. Her case became emblematic of a larger issue: how systems often fail to recognize the true worth of people based on appearances or preconceived biases. On social media, the reaction was swift and visceral. A video surfaced of Naomi walking out of the courtroom with quiet dignity after her fine had been imposed. It went viral. People admired how she had handled the situation with such grace, knowing full well that she was far more than the person standing before the judge. Online commentators questioned how a system meant to uphold justice could so easily overlook someone who had done more for global fairness than most would ever achieve in a lifetime. Public opinion quickly turned in Naomi's favor. Legal experts and human rights advocates weighed in, criticizing the judge's actions as an example of how the system often underestimates people who do not fit a traditional mold of authority. Many wondered how many others had faced similar bias, how many others had been dismissed because they didn't conform to expectations. Naomi, once a name only recognized in international circles, had now become a face of resilience against outdated assumptions. Judge Harris, meanwhile, remained unaware of the firestorm brewing around him. He continued his work, unaware that his decision in that small courtroom had sparked a much larger conversation. But as Naomi's name grew louder, so did the pressure on Harris. The weight of public opinion was shifting in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. As the stories about Naomi flooded the media, it became clear. Naomi Walker wasn't just a leader in anti-corruption. She was now a symbol of how important it was to look beyond surface judgments and see people for who they truly were. The fight for justice wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about challenging biases, especially those found in places of power, like the courtroom. As the public's outrage over Judge Harris' fine grew, Naomi remained calm, taking the situation in stride. She had spent years navigating high-stakes international investigations, dealing with corrupt leaders and shadowy figures who would stop at nothing to protect their wealth and power. A traffic ticket from a judge who didn't recognize her seemed almost trivial in comparison. But she knew the implications were deeper than they appeared. This wasn't just about an unfair fine. It was about how society, and even the justice system, overlooked people based on assumptions and appearances. Rather than letting the public outcry lead to a spectacle, Naomi took a more strategic approach. She quietly filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Oversight Committee, requesting an official review of the incident. The complaint wasn't just about the fine. It was about what that fine represented. A system that was quick to dismiss and underestimate those who didn't fit a specific mold. The request for a meeting with Judge Harris came shortly afterward. Naomi knew the importance of addressing the matter directly, in a way that would leave no room for misunderstanding. She didn't want to simply confront him. She wanted to make him see the larger picture, to help him understand how easily authority figures could fall into the trap of bias, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. When Naomi walked into Judge Harris's office a few days later, it was with the quiet confidence that had earned her respect across the globe. Harris was already seated at his desk, his expression guarded but curious. The room was uncomfortably silent as Naomi took a seat across from him. "Judge Harris," Naomi began, her tone measured but firm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Harris nodded but didn't immediately respond. He'd been preparing for this meeting, doing his best to gather information about Naomi's background. Her reputation as a global leader in anti-corruption was undeniable, and he couldn't ignore the weight of the case he had dismissed so lightly. Still, he wasn't sure what to expect from this conversation. "I want to be very clear," Naomi continued, her eyes locked onto his. "This isn't about a fine. It's about how we perceive people, how we judge them without truly understanding who they are or what they do. You didn't know who I was when I stood in your courtroom, and that's okay. But what I want you to understand is that this happens every day. People are judged by their appearance, by assumptions that have nothing to do with their character or the work they do." Naomi paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. "I lead an international task force that has brought down some of the most powerful, corrupt individuals in the world. People like that, people who deceive and steal on a massive scale, often get away with it because others look the other way. But every day, we work to ensure they are held accountable. I believe the justice system should work the same way. It should seek the truth, regardless of appearances, backgrounds, or personal biases." Judge Harris sat back, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this kind of direct challenge, but Naomi's words were compelling. He'd assumed that, as a judge, he was above reproach, that his decisions were based solely on the law. Yet here was Naomi, asking him to reflect on how deeply ingrained biases affected not only his own actions, but the entire system he served. He was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I didn't see you as more than what I saw in front of me," he admitted, his voice softer now. "I made assumptions, and now I realize that those assumptions have consequences." Naomi's gaze remained steady. "It's not too late to learn. We all make mistakes, but the important thing is how we respond when we realize we've made them." For the first time, Judge Harris felt the weight of his own actions in a way that extended beyond the rules of law. It was clear that Naomi wasn't just a leader in the fight against corruption. She was a teacher, too. As the door to his office clicked shut behind Naomi, Judge Nathaniel Harris was left in a profound silence. Her words had lingered in the room like a heavy fog, each one challenging his perceptions and forcing him to reckon with assumptions he had held for years. For a moment, he sat still, his hands resting on his desk, his mind replaying the conversation. He had heard what she said, but it was the weight of it that seemed to settle on him the hardest. Naomi had pointed out something he'd never considered: how easy it was for people in positions of power to judge others based on their surface-level traits, without ever taking the time to truly understand who they were. In her case, he had seen a woman in a courtroom, dressed simply, with no legal representation by her side. He had assumed she was just another person who had failed to comply with the system, someone who didn't have the means to fight back. But now, after hearing her speak, Harris felt the sting of his own ignorance. He had been so quick to impose his judgment, and in doing so, had completely missed the mark. Naomi was a leader, not just a bystander, in a global battle against corruption. His flippant decision had been a stark contrast to the work she did on the world stage. A woman dedicated to exposing fraud, dismantling criminal networks, and advocating for justice on a much larger scale. And yet, in that courtroom, he had treated her as though she were no different from the many others who came through on trivial charges. Harris ran his fingers through his hair, a habit he did when his thoughts were particularly unsettled. He realized that his role as a judge carried weight far beyond simply interpreting the law. his decisions, his biases, and his actions, no matter how seemingly small, had ripple effects. They could either reinforce or challenge the systems of power that shaped society. And today, Naomi had made him realize how easily he had fallen into the trap of reinforcing an unjust status quo. It wasn't just about the fine. Naomi had made it clear that her case was about something larger: the need for greater awareness, compassion, and a more thoughtful approach to justice. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, not who they appeared to be. He hadn't known Naomi's background when she entered his courtroom, and it was that ignorance that had caused the injustice. But now he was faced with the responsibility to ensure that this type of oversight didn't happen again, not just to her, but to anyone. Judge Harris stood up from his desk, his mind whirling with the realization of how much he had to learn. He had spent decades in the legal system, but Naomi had shown him how easily people in his position could overlook the truth. She had asked him to reflect, to grow. And as much as he didn't like to admit it, he knew she was right. He took a deep breath and picked up the phone. This wasn't the kind of conversation he wanted to have, but it was one he knew was necessary. He dialed the number for his assistant. "I need you to arrange a meeting with Naomi Walker," Harris said, his voice steady but determined. "I want to do more than apologize. I want to help." It was a start, Harris thought. The path forward wasn't clear, but he knew that this was where real change began, by acknowledging mistakes, understanding them, and taking meaningful steps to do better. The meeting between Judge Nathaniel Harris and Naomi Walker came just days after their initial conversation. Harris had spent that time reflecting on everything Naomi had said, poring over the stories of her work and trying to understand the global impact she had made. He'd even reached out to colleagues in the legal system, seeking their perspective on the biases that plagued the courtroom and how decisions like his could have lasting consequences beyond the immediate case. The process of self-reflection had been humbling, but necessary. Now, as he sat in his office, waiting for Naomi's arrival, Harris felt a mix of apprehension and determination. He had come to understand that the fine he had imposed was not just a minor mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper that needed to change. He had wronged Naomi, and the only way to make it right was to publicly acknowledge his error, to show the world that he wasn't just a figure of authority, but a human being willing to learn and grow. When Naomi walked into the room, she greeted him with the same composed professionalism she had shown in their previous meeting. Her expression was calm, but Harris could sense the quiet weight of expectation in her eyes. She had agreed to meet with him again, but she wasn't here for apologies. She was here to see if his words would match his actions. "Naomi," Harris began, his voice steady but laced with sincerity, "I've given a lot of thought to our conversation, and I want to begin by saying I am deeply sorry. I made a hasty decision in your case. I assumed things about you that were not only wrong, but also unjust. I failed to see you for who you really are, and I want to acknowledge that." Naomi listened without interruption, her posture relaxed but attentive. Harris could feel the weight of the apology in his words. This wasn't just about a minor misstep. It was about a fundamental failure of judgment. She had taken the time to explain her work, and he realized that the system she fought to reform was the same system that had allowed him to dismiss her so easily. Now, he understood how personal biases, even from someone with his experience, could perpetuate inequality. "I'm sorry for underestimating you," Harris continued. "I didn't recognize the immense work you've done in the fight for justice. I failed to see the bigger picture, and I regret that." Naomi's expression softened, but her eyes never wavered. She didn't expect forgiveness. It wasn't her place to give it easily. But she also recognized something important in Harris's words: accountability. The judge wasn't just apologizing because the public demanded it. He was genuinely reflecting on his actions. It was rare, especially for someone in his position. "You're not the only one who needs to learn," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "We all have biases. What matters is what we do when we realize we've acted based on them. The real challenge is in what comes next." Judge Harris nodded. "I agree. And that's why I'm asking for your help. I want to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again, not just in my courtroom, but throughout the system. I want to learn more about the work you're doing, how we can work together to make a real change." The sincerity in Harris's voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, Naomi believed that he wasn't just offering empty words. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for partnership. It was a gesture she hadn't expected, but one she found promising. "I'm willing to help," Naomi replied. "But it's not just about understanding my work. It's about understanding the systems that have allowed biases like yours to persist. You're taking the first step, Judge. That's the beginning of real change." And for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope that the justice system, too, could evolve. This wasn't just an apology. It was the start of something larger. As Naomi walked out of Judge Harris's office, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led them both here. It had been an unexpected turn of events, a minor traffic violation that had ignited a conversation about biases, assumptions, and the true nature of justice. Naomi had never anticipated that a simple courtroom encounter would lead to such a profound exchange. But what mattered most was that Harris had not only listened, but had taken responsibility for his actions. In doing so, he had shown a willingness to evolve, to face uncomfortable truths, and to make a difference. As she left the courthouse that day, her phone buzzed with messages from her team about ongoing investigations and urgent tasks to address. But something in the back of her mind kept pulling her back to the conversation with Harris. The shift in his perspective was significant, not just for him, but for the broader legal system. For the first time, she felt that there might be an opportunity to create real, systemic change within an institution that had long struggled with fairness and accountability. Weeks passed, and the media buzz around Naomi's encounter with Judge Harris gradually quieted. But Naomi and Harris remained in contact. Their meetings became more frequent, moving beyond personal apologies to real action. Harris began to attend conferences and workshops led by Naomi's team, learning more about the global anti-corruption movement and how issues of bias and inequality impacted both domestic and international systems. Naomi, for her part, found herself developing a new respect for Harris's willingness to learn and adapt, especially given his long career in the judicial system. Together, they began drafting a proposal for a nationwide program aimed at addressing bias in the legal system, specifically within local courts. They developed training modules for judges and law enforcement officers that focused on recognizing implicit biases, reevaluating how defendants were treated, and encouraging a more inclusive approach to justice. Naomi's insights as a leader in global anti-corruption efforts gave her the unique ability to bridge the gap between the world of law enforcement and the pressing need for systemic change in everyday legal processes. Naomi knew it wouldn't be easy. Reforming a justice system wasn't a task for the faint of heart. But she also knew that real change started with people who were willing to question their own assumptions and work towards something better. Harris was an example of that change. His public apology had been just the beginning, but his commitment to action would resonate far beyond their partnership. The first results of their collaboration came when a new pilot program was launched in Harris District, aimed at training judges and other legal professionals to recognize and address bias in their decision-making processes. Within months, there was a noticeable shift in the way cases were handled, an increasing focus on fairness, understanding, and second chances for those who had long been marginalized by a system that often failed to see them as individuals. Naomi knew this was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. The work was far from finished, but with partners like Judge Harris, someone who had been willing to listen, learn, and take action, the road ahead felt a little bit brighter. In the end, their unexpected meeting in that courtroom had sparked more than just a conversation. It had laid the groundwork for a partnership that could change the very fabric of justice. And for Naomi, that was the most rewarding victory of all.